Welcome to SmithWeekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of SmithWeekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience of SmithWeekly, including Todd A., Jeff S., Paul M., Dave V., and Cindy W. We've got a new guest on the program today and one we're pleased to have join us. Mr. John Kotek has joined us on the program. John is the Senior Vice President of Policy at the Nuclear Energy Institute. The organization's mission is to promote the use and growth of nuclear energy through efficient operations and effective policy, providing a unified industry voice before the United States federal government, state and local government, the federal regulators of the industry, as well as international organizations and venues on key policy issues surrounding nuclear energy. You can learn more about the NEI and their work by visiting their website, nei.org. Mr. Kotek, welcome to SmithWeekly Discussions.
Andrew, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, John. Good to have you on the program, and we've, of course, got some good stuff to talk about. Of course, I want to get into fuel cycle, policy matters, mining, and more. But why don't we kick this off first with you covering your background and experience in the nuclear energy industry?
Sure, happy to. So as you mentioned earlier, I now run the policy division here at the Nuclear Energy Institute. You described the organization very well. We've got about 350 members from more than a dozen countries, but really focused on the civil nuclear energy industry here in the U.S. My background, I'm a nuclear engineer by training and started out working in our Department of Energy 35 years ago. Since then, have spent a lot of my career in the Department of Energy and the National Laboratory System, culminating with running the Department of Energy's Office of Nuclear Energy the last couple of years of the Obama administration. In between times in government and the national labs, I've spent a fair bit of time in industry and then here at NEI working on facility siting, working on mining, working on the nuclear fuel and spent nuclear fuel issue and what to do about that. Came to NEI after departing the Obama administration at a time when really the outlook for nuclear was challenged. We were seeing plants shut down and more announcements for plants planning to shut down. And in the 8 years since I've been here, we've seen a remarkable transformation in the industry, driven largely by people really coming to recognize nuclear for what it delivers in terms of being an always-on, reliable and clean source of electricity that's really going to be essential as we continue to grow our electricity and energy demands here in the U.S. and around the world.
John, thank you for that, and quite a diverse and extensive background. It's good to have a person of your nature and, of course, expertise on the program and, of course, over at the NEI to continue progressing the goals of the organization. And certainly I can appreciate that. And further, we can appreciate your efforts to bring in proper energy into the discussion and, of course, education on that front as well. You know, you've seen probably, John, given the time you've been in the industry, you've seen the ups and downs and, of course, the appetite for commercial reactors, both in the United States and, of course, in other jurisdictions. You've also seen the suppression of concept of splitting atoms and the technology of splitting atoms by other energy source interests that are inferior to nuclear. What is your view of where nuclear is today in that progression of the technology and the expansion? And what are your expectations for the industry, John, over the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
Great question. In terms of where the industry stands now and the technology stands, we've achieved that broad recognition of the value of nuclear. And what nuclear brings to the grid, of course, as a 24/7 producer of very large amounts of electricity, has been undervalued historically in markets. And as I mentioned earlier, we did see several reactors shut down for economic reasons over the last 6-8 years. uh, because they were being inadequately compensated in electricity markets and in my view, not being valued for all that they deliver. That's starting to change, and you've started to see, for example, some big tech firms entering into deals to both offtake power from existing reactors, even bring some reactors back that had been closed down in the last handful of years. But you've also seen some of these companies entering into agreements that will lead to construction of new nuclear power plants in the U.S. There are a lot of reasons for why we've seen this transformation in the outlook and the fortunes for nuclear power. Certainly, the efforts by some of our utilities and by some customers to see increasing deployments of clean energy has helped. Concerns about energy security and system reliability have also helped. And even unfortunate situations like weather-induced disasters and power outages that we've seen have really underscored the importance of a very robust and reliable technology like nuclear. On the global scene, we've also seen a real uptick in interest in nuclear. Certainly in places like Europe, largely driven by the decarbonization imperative at the outset, but then more recently by the Russian assault on Ukraine and what that did to energy prices, what that did to energy security, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, but I'd say across the continent. It really drove home the importance of not being reliant on Russia for natural gas deliveries. And so, of course, the U.S. natural gas sector has had a lot to do with responding to that and keeping the lights on and the heat working in Europe. But it's also led to an increased interest in nuclear power. So we've seen several countries that had been planning to shut down their nuclear power plants reverse those decisions, and even go so far as to say they want to build new nuclear. So, France was in a situation like that, but Sweden and other countries as well have decided to expand nuclear when they were thinking about constraining it just a short while ago. And then countries like Poland, who are really on the front lines of this issue of over reliance on Russia as a source of energy supply, they've made a 180 and they've decided they don't want to have anything to do with the Russian as a source of energy supply to the extent they can help it. And now they're off working to build 3 U.S. provided nuclear power plants. Other countries like Romania are moving down the path of building U.S. nuclear. Bulgaria is in the same boat. The Ukrainians want to, if we can, just get to a place where they're able to engage in new construction. And so there's quite a lot of interest in Central and Eastern Europe and beyond in new nuclear, driven by both the desire to move to a cleaner energy system, but certainly to a more reliable energy system working with more reliable energy partners.
John, thank you for that, and I take note that you said it properly, a cleaner source, and I want to come back to that comment in just a moment and cover a few other things. And very good overview here, and definitely lots of changes to where this is turning and where we think it's going. And after a decade plus now of really poor sentiment and post Fukushima, lack of appetite out there, and all the things that have happened. And then people just come into the realization of those, Fukushima, for example, and what really was the true accident that happened there with respect to Fukushima. And I can tell you it wasn't a reactor complex. It had to do with an earthquake and a massive tsunami that wiped a bunch of people out. But just the turn here, just in the short time that I've been here in this industry, so much different today than say in 2016, for example. So I appreciate how you're looking at this and some of your comments there, which we'll dive into some of these in more detail in a moment. But I want to come back to, maybe we can talk from a U.S. perspective here. Personnel for this industry, from a competency and technical ability front. Just in my short time in the industry, it leads me to be of the position that we are lacking expertise and that we're not replacing outgoing personnel that have had long careers in the industry. What are your thoughts on this, and where are the bottlenecks in your view? As I really see it as really early education program levels and then up from there. What are your thoughts on this issue?
Great point. And just to underscore it, this issue of workforce and availability of qualified staff routinely shows up at the top of our member surveys in terms of the issues that our member companies are concerned about. And so while with the existing reactors that we're operating, those are extraordinarily well run and properly staffed. When you look to the future, we're going to need quite a large increase in the number of folks working in the industry, unsurprisingly, if we're going to particularly meet or come close to this global tripling of nuclear energy pledge, which the U.S. and about 30 other countries have signed on to. So we do a number of things here at NEI, and our member companies are doing quite a number of things to try to meet this forecast growth in demand. To get a sense of the scale of the increased demand for workers, I would recommend to your listeners a report came out of the U.S. Department of Energy here earlier in the year called Pathways to Commercial Liftoff. And DOE has done a number in this series. There are one particularly focused on next generation nuclear power. What DOE found was that we're going to need something like 375,000 people new to the industry over the next couple of decades if we're going to meet nuclear energy growth projections. Now, today that figure sits in the neighborhood of 100,000. So it gives you a sense of what that growth is going to need to look like if we're going to get to the scale of new plant construction and operation that we're aiming for. So where do we get those folks? Well, of course, people can come from any number of places and wind up with a career in nuclear, but 4 of them particularly stand out to us. One, of course, as you alluded to, is those trained nuclear engineers or people who otherwise have a college level of training and education in things nuclear. And certainly we draw from other forms of engineers, mechanical engineers, electricals. There's a lot of others who can play a role in nuclear. We need some of those at plant sites. We need fairly large numbers as well in the companies that are designing new nuclear, the companies that will be engaged in construction, and then certainly within our national laboratory system, need a lot of those university trained professionals. And so we work with something called the Nuclear Engineering Department Heads Organization to try to help them understand what the forecast demand looks like and help them to draw attention to their programs and get the support they need within their universities to be ready to train an increasing number of college graduates in this field. So that's one. A second pathway is through our labor unions. And a third, somewhat parallel pathway can be through community college programs that are focused on training people to do the construction, to do the operations themselves, to engage in plant maintenance. So, for example, we've got very strong relationships with labor unions who provide a very large share of the existing workforce at today's nuclear reactors, and who are going to be essential as we get into construction, where you're going to need the building trades folks and the pipe fitters and the electricians and the others who are going to contribute to successful completion and operation of new nuclear plants. So we work with them extensively to ensure that they are also aware of workforce projections. And I'll never forget what a very senior union official told me years ago when I asked him about this issue of workforce availability. He said, "You show me the jobs and I'll get you the people." Because our people see nuclear energy and a career in the nuclear field as the best pathway to the middle class for somebody who doesn't hold a 4-year college degree. Because it's a well-paying job, it's a safe job, it's a job that lasts a long time. Right? Today's nuclear plants, most of them are licensed to operate out to 60 years. Most of them are pursuing the ability to run out to 80 years. I know people who are second or even third generation at the same nuclear plant, right? So you can build a family and a community and a life around a career at a nuclear power plant. So whether it's that second path of people coming through labor unions or that third path identified of folks coming up through the community college system, right? We have programs in place that will need to be expanded, and that we need to get people into. But those exist, and the pathways are well proven. We do a lot through an organization called Nuclear Matters that I'm happy to talk about a little bit later, to draw attention to opportunities in programs like those to get more people in. The fourth pathway, and another one that we use Nuclear Matters to draw attention to, is people coming out of the military. Right? And so, of course, we have the nuclear navy, which, like our civilian nuclear fleet, operates on the order of 100 nuclear reactors. Quite an outstanding source of nuclear trained professionals, people who are very experienced in nuclear facility operations, nuclear plant maintenance, what have you. And so, from either the nuclear navy or for other parts of the military, we have quite a number of people who come into plant operations positions, but also plant maintenance or even plant security positions. And so, again, that through programs like Helmets to Hard Hats, we work extensively with the military and with organizations that support our veterans to draw attention to the opportunities that exist in nuclear. So sorry for the long answer, but there's quite a bit going on in that area, and you've touched on a particularly timely topic for us as we seek to build that workforce of the future.
John, very good points here on how this is coming together and how you guys have been able to pull from these different sources. And of course, I think some of the best features of this industry is that long-term nature. I mean, short of potentially, a gold or copper mining project somewhere in the world that has a mine life of 40 years or what have you, there's not many industries that have this type of lifespan associated. And I think that's a very attractive feature to a certain demographic of people who want to get involved with these types of industries, as well as the wealth creation that can come out of these as well.
Yep.
And obviously, these jobs are higher paying jobs. That obviously attracts more people. The military sourcing of people, personnel, it's a great discipline to be able to pull folks coming out of that area into this as well. Because, like you said, a lot of it, whether you're talking even segments such as mining of uranium, for example, or dealing in the fuel cycle, all this is very technical stuff that is very important for it to all succeed. And of course, you and I didn't really touch on it here, but we've seen substantial shortfalls in technical expertise coming out of the mining segment as well. Just going back to something you said earlier, and I think it's worth you giving us essentially your definition, your thoughts on this matter, because we see it misused often, John. It's mischaracterized as kind of an advertising terminology, but the comments out there about clean energy, green energy, carbon-free energy. Well, I think you and I both know that whether you're running a hydro facility or you're running a commercial reactor or you're running a wind farm, which hopefully not on the wind farm, but all of this stuff requires a lot of inputs that require the use of fossil fuels. That is not, it has a carbon impact. There's lots of impacts here to where at the end, you have to look at it on a total life cycle basis, kind of cradle to grave, if you will. And when you look at that and you compare all these forms of energies, nat gas, oil, looking at things like diesel, you're looking at things like wind and solar and the impact on the land and the footprint, all those things weigh into it. And when you come back and you look at something like hydro, you look at something like nuclear, for example, there is only a small amount of actual energy sources that are considered in the cleaner category, or if you extend it out through their life, in the case of commercial reactors, you might actually get to a carbon-free at the end, potentially. Just talk about that and talk about maybe some of the misunderstanding about what clean energy is, green energy, and these types of terminologies versus what the reality is.
Yeah, and you've really touched on the important term, and that's life cycle. You have to look at these things on a cradle to grave basis. And when you do, you find that nuclear actually has lower life cycle carbon emissions per unit of electricity generated than even things like wind and solar. Where I sit and where our members sit is they see a role for those technologies. And to be sure, we've seen production costs, particularly with solar, come down considerably. And so, we see that those technologies have a role to play, but what frustrates me is when you get people who are trying to convince policymakers that you can run an entire electric grid on only technologies like wind, solar, and storage. And my old boss, Ernie Moniz, when I was working in the energy department, used to say, look, it doesn't necessarily violate the laws of physics to do that, but what you're doing is you're just making it a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult to power the grid than if you leave out firm clean technologies like nuclear and like gas with carbon capture, deep geothermal. I mean, there are other technologies that can run around the clock and bring you that cleaner power that more consumers are asking for. But you've got to look at the entire system. And when you look at a system, having something that's available around the clock for long periods of time, as you know, a nuclear power plant will operate between 18 and 24 months between refuelings. So you've got you've got fuel security embodied in that facility, as well as these other attributes we talked about. And so having that on the system avoids having to overbuild other technologies that you would otherwise need to ensure reliability and system resilience. Because the other thing that people tend to forget is you don't build an electric grid, you don't build our electricity system to serve load on an average day. You serve it to you build it to serve load on the worst day, right? When weather's challenging, you've got some sort of whether it's really cold snap, really hot weather, maybe you've got some other sort of natural phenomena that's straining the grid. You need to keep that grid running on the worst day, and you need to have margin in there in case you lose facilities that you're relying on to keep the lights on that worst day. And nuclear power gives you the ability to not have to so overbuild things like wind, solar storage, and long distance transmission on that worst day. And as a result, even though an individual nuclear power plant, if you're talking about building a new one, may look expensive, what it does for you in terms of avoiding the need to have to overbuild those intermittent technologies and the storage and the transmission to make the system work, you actually wind up with a lower life cycle cost and a more resilient system for customers at the end of the day. And that's important because when the power goes out, unfortunately, people die. I mean, we saw that in Texas a couple of years ago. Electricity is so essential to our day-to-day lives. We have to have a reliable, resilient system, and nuclear can play a huge role in that.
Well said, John. I appreciate your comments on this and how you characterize and how you look at this as well. Very important for the audience to understand. And often we've used the term over here more so than recent years, quality of energy, and
Mm-hmm.
how that quality of energy relates to that total life cycle.
Yep.
And so really appreciate your comments on this matter. I want to get into the fuel cycle, John.
Mm-hmm.
First up, we have a new administration that is expected to take office early in the new year, if everything goes according to plans, and looking at past administration entrances in January. Any
Mm-hmm.
thoughts on how you see this incoming administration and their appetite to actually encourage a new era and build out of commercial reactors in the U.S., John, first and foremost from a domestic standpoint, but also work to reinstate and take market share away from competitors and put back the U.S. potentially as the commercial reactor export leader as well?
Yeah,
What do you
no,
think?
such important points, Andrew. Appreciate you bringing that up. And certainly, we do have the first Trump term and Trump administration to look back on for clues as to how things might go going forward. And you mentioned mining and nuclear fuel at the outset, and you did see the first Trump administration, the formation of something called the United States Nuclear Fuel Working Group, run out of the Energy Department, and issued a report on restoring American nuclear energy leadership that included quite a bit focused on restoring our ability not just mine uranium, but to take the steps in between to get to nuclear fuel. Just for the benefit of listeners who might not be familiar with the process of producing nuclear fuel. When you dig uranium out of the ground, that uranium is not sufficiently concentrated in the isotope of uranium that you need to run a fission reactor. So it's something called uranium-235. Most of what you dig out of the ground is uranium-238. So you have to concentrate that up from the less than 1% uranium-235 that's in the uranium existing naturally and concentrate it into the 3 to 5% range for today's reactors. And so that requires a couple of steps. First, you have to convert the mined uranium into a gas. So we call that uranium conversion. And then you have to enrich that uranium to get up to that 3 to 5% concentration. And so those uranium conversion and uranium enrichment capabilities are things that we have here in the US, but we don't have enough to meet our needs. We've become reliant on foreign suppliers, and particularly on Russia, which controls roughly half of the world's enrichment capacity and roughly a third of the conversion capacity. Now, once you enrich your uranium, you then need to take the final step of turning it into uranium fuel, and we do all that in the US. So, we've got to bolster those uranium conversion and enrichment capabilities in addition to strengthening uranium mining and ensuring security of supply there. On the mining side, we're seeing more mining taking place in the US. We're also seeing there's quite a bit of import from Canada, from Australia, from Kazakhstan into the US. So quite a bit of activity there. The government has been appropriated more than $3 billion to help spur the growth of the conversion and enrichment capacity here in the US that we're going to need. That the Department of Energy is responsible for managing those programs. It'll be really important for the next administration to ensure that those dollars are well spent and they lead to actual, real, new capabilities here in the U.S. to serve the marketplace. So that was a conversation really started under the first Trump term and continued during the Biden administration, and like I said, led to appropriation of more than $3 billion from Congress to help address the issue. And so there's funds there, there's authorization there. We're going to need to see the new administration really finish the job there and ensure that that funding leads to new capability. In terms of getting to new build and then to exports, there's quite a bit of interest among utility members. Our members here at NEI, who represent a little less than half of the electricity generation on the grid, they alone have identified the need for more than a doubling of today's reactor fleet. So there's a lot of demand there. The question is going to be, how do you get over the first of a kind cost hurdles that come with a capital intensive new technology like this? And so we're going to need to see some policy action there. I do think it's going to be important to retain the incentives for new nuclear construction that were included in bills passed within the current administration. I do think that when it comes to exports, it's going to be important to build here in North America first before the export market will really take off. We have seen, as I mentioned earlier, our friends in Poland order 3 of the Westinghouse AP1000 large reactor designs. Those, of course, are the same ones that have been built successfully here in the state of Georgia at the Vogtle site. Our friends in Canada, Ontario Power Generation, are planning on building multiples of General Electric's small modular reactor design. So we are seeing real projects taking root, but we need to see more. And it's going to take some, I'd say, some cost sharing between developers, utilities, states, and the federal government to get past this first of a kind hump and then get to widespread new nuclear deployment that's going to enable us to start deploying globally at greater scale. It's important that we do that now. I mean, today, China has 31 new reactors under construction. We have a handful that have started pre-construction activities, but we're nowhere near where they are. Russia controls more than half of the global export business. Between Russia and China, I want to say the number's north of 80% of all global construction projects underway are in Russian or Chinese hands. We've got to get back into this business, and it starts by deploying here at home, but then by strengthening our export capabilities. Because one thing that folks forget is our companies are trying to compete against countries. Like Russia and China, they have state-owned or controlled nuclear energy enterprise. We don't. And so our country needs to do things like provide export financing that other countries do as a matter of course because they're supporting their state-owned champion. Here in the U.S., we need to be able to compete with that, and that's things like the Export-Import Bank and the Development Finance Corporation. So we're going to need to see tools like that strengthened along with the demonstration of the new technologies and deployment of those technologies here at home to really compete and win on the global stage.
John agreed, and suffice to say that in this case, we need to have a healthy, robust domestic program to be able to gain the legitimacy for clients outside, turnkey clients, to actually look us in the face seriously and say, yes, we want to have a conversation. Because I liken it to these conversations where you've got the seller of the turnkey export reactors in two different rooms, and essentially the U.S. as it stood previously and even currently today, the negotiation often is won out by the competitor. Whether that has to do with, we'll sell you enrichment, we'll sell you the fuel cycle, we'll give you the fuel cycle. The U.S. might be more reluctant with certain clients to say, oh, we're not going to give you the fuel cycle. Well, that conversation's a little bit weak these days, especially when you have two other peers in the other rooms willing to give you that. There has to be some rethinking on how that strategy plays out. And then, of course, like you said, you have to have these partnerships between all these groups get together to be able to match up with some of the order books you said. Of course, we know the Russian order book is quite large. You touched on Russia. As you know, Russia sourced material and services for the U.S. domestic fleet is quite large. There's, of course, waivers and grievances out there for those utilities who are kind of caught short of non-Russian sources of supplies and services. Just at this point, given what's happened here with respect to bans and some of those things that are happening on the political front, how do you think this matter gets resolved, given the U.S. is currently, I would say, addicted to Russia-sourced material, and it needs to develop its own domestic fuel to meet in excess of 100% of domestic requirements? But that will take, of course, a long time. What are your thoughts on this, John? And do you think utilities will be able to get the government to allow a waiting period, i.e. waivers, to make this transition for conversion and enrichment, the whole fuel cycle? Really, obviously, we know that's going to take a long time, but how do you think this plays out as far as the government flexibility to allow utilities to continue to obviously operate their plants, which they still need some of this Russia source material in the short term?
Certainly, the law that Congress passed along with the appropriation does provide for waivers, but by 2028 that expires, and so the expectation is that by that time we can see both the U.S. and our allies build up sufficient capacity for both conversion and enrichment to enable a wholesale move away from Russia as a source of supply. Now, of course, the Russians announced here a few weeks ago that they were going to stop exporting to the U.S. Fortunately, what's happened in the intervening years since the Russian assault on Ukraine was a lot more cooperation going on internationally that has left the industry better positioned to deal with the current situation. Things like the Sapporo 5 agreement, you may remember, where the U.S. and several of our allies agreed that we were going to invest considerably in new conversion and enrichment capabilities, are leading to plans to expand capacity, not just here in the U.S., but also in Europe and other parts of the world. So we're seeing movement in the right direction. I do want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier regarding our competitiveness in the global marketplace. One thing I do want to make sure folks come away with is, while it certainly is important for us to kind of be in the ballpark when it comes to some of these other provisions associated with exports, the U.S. has a lot going for us. This is a technology that we invented. This is a technology that we operate better than anybody in the world. We've got capacity factors of north of 92% and a safety record that's second to none. And we also have the world's leading nuclear energy innovation ecosystem. And so people look at the several dozen companies that we have that are seeking to develop and deploy and commercialize new nuclear reactor technologies. Other countries, they've got their national champion and maybe a few folks in universities working on it. That's about it, right? The ideas tend to come from here in the U.S., We've also got a system of national laboratories and universities that are the envy of the world when it comes to technology development. So I just wanted to sort of underscore the point. We don't need to match our Russian and Chinese competitors kind of point for point, because we do have some advantages that they can't match. It is essential that, particularly in the financing space, for example, that we be in the ballpark and allow our other advantages to help us win the day. But great, you made a great set of points and asking good questions on that. I just wanted to round that discussion out there.
Very good points there as well, John. I appreciate that. And with respect to the waivers, just back to that real quick, it's going to cause, I would hope, I mean, it's a little bit of a difficulty here in the sense that, you got 4 years to turn this over. That's a challenge. I mean, for any type of expansion, that's one heck of a challenge, especially with regulatory. I mean, we know, and I'll jump into ConverDyn here in a moment, but we certainly have, that's going to be a challenge to meet that 4-year period. That's fairly short, especially when you have, in a sense, John, and we'll talk a little bit more about red tape in a moment, but you do have a lot of red tape to cut through to be able to get that done in 4 years. And it seems like that's going to take one heck of an effort to get there. I mean, not saying it's not going to at least get started, but it's been difficult. I mean, the working group, of course, has been a bit of a challenge. Some of the RFPs that have come out, we've got the appropriations, the money's been set aside. It's just a matter of, okay, how does that procurement get managed? Does it get managed properly? The government's pretty wasteful. They need to do a better job on some of this stuff. And it seems like it's just taken a longer than it probably should, given the actual market conditions. At least that's how we look at it. Uranium mining in the U.S., short of 1 year ago, 2 years ago, I mean, it was pretty much nil. It barely registered on the EIA chart. Very, very little production coming out of the U.S. Because the price is elevated here, we're starting to get some bottlenecks sorted. Some of the productive capacity of the U.S. is starting to get online. Most of them are having troubles, not all of them, but some of them are certainly having troubles or taking longer than expected to get back up in action. But let's just use the ConverDyn example for a moment here on the conversion front. They're fully booked. Their capacity is fully booked through the end of the decade on conversion, which you and I both know that there's not enough existing capacity to handle domestic needs for conversion services prior to the end of the decade. Just from a policy standpoint, what is your view on this as far as how long, or what you think should maybe change on a policy front to facilitate acceleration here that we think we can get done? And then how long you really think realistically, John, just to give us a flavor, how long would it really take to alleviate the fuel cycle conversion bottleneck, if we want to just focus on that, if it was to be solved through domestic capacity improvement or through other non-Russia sources? Because for me, I look at this right now from our desk, and given what we've seen with respect to the progression, it seems like it's going to take well beyond the end of the decade to finally get there.
To that last question about what it would specifically take, frankly, I'm going to leave that one for the ConverDyns of the world to answer. They're better positioned to speak to that than I am. To your earlier question about the pace at which things are moving within government, we have not at all been shy about voicing our concern as well, and kind of hearkening back to my earlier comments. That's why we do think it's just so important that the new administration focus on effective execution. You asked about policies, and we've seen Congress enact a strong set of policies and provide robust appropriations to back them up. I think now it's about actually executing, on the authorities and responsibly and effectively using the funding that has been provided. And again, going back to the first Trump administration, we did see quite a lot of focus on this issue, and so I think people who come in, it still of course remains to be seen who is going to populate key positions within the new administration. But I think there's a pretty strong basis of understanding coming in regarding the importance of this issue. To your comment about mining more broadly and the challenges in getting started, I think that's another area that people have finally started to recognize the importance of. I mentioned in my intro that I spent some time working mining. In fact, when I was a public affairs consultant, worked with quite a number of mining clients in the Intermountain West. And without naming names, one of our former clients recently received a final environmental impact statement from the cognizant federal agency, 14 years after they began conversations about permitting a facility. And this wasn't even a new site. This was actually a previously mined site that they wanted to go in and remine and clean up as they went. And that took a decade and a half. And I think there is this recognition that if we're going to come anywhere close to meeting our energy needs here in the US, we're going to have to find ways to move through these permitting processes faster, particularly with this emergence over the last year or so in the anticipated demand growth being driven by AI and data center applications on top of what we already expected to see in terms of growth from things like building and transportation electrification. The demand growth projections and the rate of increase over the last year are just staggering. And frankly, it's nothing that I think any of the big utility companies in the U.S. have ever really lived through in terms of the scale of new deployment that's going to be required. And so I do think our permitting agencies in particular, but people, all forms of stakeholders are going to have to really bring a new mindset to this question of permitting if we're going to be able to meet the growth in electricity demand that's forthcoming. And this matters, right? I mean, if we're going to lose the AI race to China because we can't power AI systems and build new generation fast enough, we just can't let that happen. And so I do think there needs to be a different mindset, and I'm optimistic the new administration is going to come in focused on tackling that challenge.
Very good. I appreciate the comments on this as well. And just another important issue. I mean, this is very, very first and foremost important that you hit the nail on the head, essentially, that the regulatory process, the permitting process, is one of those big areas that is really holding this back. I mean, if I can go to Africa, and again, I won't name countries either, and in your case, naming companies, there's so few, so I understand why you wouldn't, in the sense that if you can get a mine permitted in 14 months, 16 months in Africa of a proven jurisdiction, that actually can still be done. And really at a standard that is very similar to domestic US mining. And so it's like, okay, well, that just doesn't equate at all anywhere close. And so I appreciate the comments there. And I do think that that is a very big issue in the room that needs to be handled properly. And there's got to be a sense of acceleration here because we have the standards in place. I mean, you and I both know the spec books. You need a dump truck to back up with a spec book these days. It's almost ridiculous, John. And so we know that those best management practices are in place, and we can certainly do these things. It's not something that's new, or the risks are well known, they're well mitigated, et cetera. Just with on the mining side here, just to talk a little bit about uranium and just get your flavor for your comments on what you think here. As you know, there is a uranium supply deficit out there. How do you see demand from utilities coming in over the next few years on an immediate need basis, and then also just that overall inventory building basis? We know that just-in-time inventory, John, does not work in this industry. You have to have an inventory. You have to have a backup plan. You got to think strategically. Just briefly, what is your view on the current uranium market, where it stands today, and any position from your desk as to where the price of uranium sits today, if it's something that probably increases to facilitate more production given the bottlenecks, or just how you see the price today as well?
The price issue, I'm not much of a forecaster there. What I do see coming, though, is I'd say increased firming of plans for new nuclear build in the U.S. We're very much engaged right now with Congress on addressing those early of a kind issues that I talked about earlier. If we're successful in getting some sort of a policy in place that increases utility management and shareholder and public utility commission confidence in their ability to successfully move forward with new nuclear, I think that's going to tend to put some more upward pressure on demand. I do think that certainly we've seen increased interest in keeping today's reactors online just as long as we can. I expect to see that sort of dynamic take hold, increasing hold in other places around the world. I do also think we're starting to see our friends in Japan move beyond the relatively limited number of reactors that they've been able to restart. We just had another restart announcement here, and I think they're trending in a positive direction there. And in the government in the last year or two even talked about the importance of replacing shutdown plants with new. So I think globally you're going to continue to see an increased demand for uranium, just driven by the fact that more and more plant proposals are getting more and more real, whether that's in the form of restarts or in the form of new build. And so I tend to think that demand is continue to trend pretty strongly upward.
Absolutely agreed. And same position here. We typically use 2 to 3 years out on actual reactors planned to come online. So basically advanced construction that's well underway. We start to look at this from a 2 to 3 year forward basis, and certainly don't even account for anything really beyond that. Although the list is getting quite long, John, as you know. I think you and I would both agree certainly that the entire fuel cycle from mining to fabrication is absolutely a necessity in the US. I would say on a 100% basis with some margin as well, coming down the road here. And I think the timing is going to take certainly well into the 30s, if not further than that, to actually get to that stage, because it's going to require a lot of work and a lot of capital and a lot of expertise and a good permitting process that makes sense. Um, I want to ask you, John, and appreciate the time here, and lots more to talk about. I'll try to keep my
Mm-hmm.
talking down just to get and hear from you, which is what we want to do here. But want to ask for your thoughts on conventional reactor deployment in the States versus the appetite and viability of SMR deployment by the end of the decade. Based on your experience, do you think there would be demand remaining for conventional reactors on a new build basis? Or do you think SMRs really have the flavor of the day for even regulators, private owners such as large business, tech companies, for example, and utilities? What do you think that they would want in their portfolio going forward at this point?
Yeah, and that's such an important question these days, and I don't think anyone knows for sure. And frankly, from where I sit, it's going to be one of the really fun things to watch over the next decade. We have seen more and more conversation around large plants. I mentioned the AP1000 earlier. For quite a long time, 20 years or so, we just weren't seeing much in the way of demand growth. And as a result, when you were talking about bringing new generation online, maybe a utilities plan on retiring a coal plant or something, right? And you need to bring something in to replace that. And sure, there was some growth that needed to be met, and we did see coal plant retirements, largely replaced by natural gas and some wind and solar. But as you look out now, these forecasts of demand growth I mentioned earlier are to the point where maybe an SMR of a few hundred megawatts to replace a retiring coal plant. That maybe you're now thinking, well, I don't want something that's a few hundred megawatts. I'm going to need a few thousand megawatts, and so maybe I'm looking at a large reactor. And so we still have utility members that are very focused on SMRs. We have others that are starting to talk more about the big plants. I'd say globally the picture's the same. We've seen countries like Poland decide to go with the large reactors. Romania is going with the SMRs as one example. I mentioned our friends in Canada are building an SMR, the GE design, and planning on having that online around the end of this decade. So that this it's playing out now, the dynamic that you talked about. Just for your listeners' edification and clarification, when we talk about SMRs, folks do tend to lump in a wide variety of plants under that heading. So you've got the typical kind of traditional water-cooled reactors that are being brought forward in the form of small modular reactors, SMRs. So that's like the GE design I mentioned. A company called NuScale has one that's been licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Other companies like Holtec, Westinghouse, Rolls-Royce have water-cooled small modular reactor designs that are at various stages of the commercialization project. And so those are all water-cooled. They're kind of a derivative of today's reactors. Then there's another class of reactors out there that we tend to term advanced reactors, but they can fit under this SMR umbrella as well. That's things like the Bill Gates sodium-cooled fast spectrum reactor that is just started construction in the state of Wyoming. That's a 345 megawatt reactor. A company called X Energy is developing a gas cooled reactor that's intended to be built in 4-packs, which will have 320 megawatts of power output. So you can see it's still in that same few hundred megawatt power capacity, but they're different from what we used to think of as SMRs just being the water cooled design. The interesting thing about some of these advanced reactors is that they operate at significantly higher reactor outlet temperatures. As a result, you've got higher temperature, higher quality process heat that you could bring to other energy end uses. So, going beyond or in addition to bulk power supply to the grid, you can start thinking about using these as a source of process heat for oil and gas production and refining, chemical manufacturing, in the iron and steel business, pulp and paper, hydrogen production. So there's maybe production of sustainable fuels for aviation or marine transport. So there's a wider variety of potential end uses you can get to when you start thinking about some of these advanced reactors. Some of these advanced reactors are also being developed in microreactor scale. That's more in the single digit megawatt, maybe a few teen megawatt electric range. And that sort of design can be very well suited for mining applications or other remote locations, or maybe for military bases where you need a few megawatts of supply, or other places where you need very reliable and robust power generation. So you've got this wide range of new technologies coming to the market. Like I said, the GE SMR we should see by the end of this decade, the Bill Gates TerraPower and the X Energy projects I mentioned. That the X Energy I should have mentioned is being built in Texas to help power and provide heat to a Dow chemical facility. Those are more early 2030 timeframes. And then some of the microreactors might be demonstrated even sooner. There are quite a number planning on demonstrating out at the Idaho National Laboratory site within the next 3 years, for example. So there's quite a bit going on there on somewhat different schedules, but by the early part of the next decade, we should have several of these well in hand and having been demonstrated at commercial scale.
John, that was going to lead me into some of the other discussion on this I wanted to have before we move on to a few other things. As you know, they're essentially collectively new to commercial markets in a sense. But of course, as you know, you and I both know that existing SMR technology, if you will, has existed with naval applications going back to around the 1960s.
Yep.
Roughly. I don't have my date exact tight there, but 1960s is good enough here. Well, I'm really seeing kind of two different pathways when it comes to SMR commercial deployment. One is that new technology that needs to go through the full licensing process, needs to have discussions with industry participants on the fabrication side to make sure that they're tooled properly to build some of these new components. And that really just kind of includes your exotic designs, your salt cooled stuff you mentioned, HALEU, a fuel type less than 20% enrichment, where industry is not tooled and built out properly to support them immediately. And then, of course, you have your other technologies in between there. But then the other pathway, John, really being that essentially off the shelf existing PWR designs. And in that case there, I think that one, because it's off the shelf, the GE Hitachis, the BWXT support on these, I see those as really the most viable to probably the most rapid deployment, because industry is essentially set up for them to come out a little bit better, faster. Licensing is not as big as a challenge. Do you think that is the case, John? And then let me ask you this. Should there be consolidation in the SMR industry to concentrate talent and improve the likelihood of a successful commercial deployment?
So I have to start by saying, just about all of these companies are NEI member companies, and so of course we want to see them all succeed, right? But to your point, if you look at other industries, that you could see a parallel where, at the outset, you've got quite a number of entrants, and as they work through the process of trying to bring their technologies to marketplace, maybe some of them don't make it, and you do see, mergers taking place or acquisitions or technologies being sold off, et cetera. That would be an unsurprising result, right? And I don't think anybody expects to see, whatever the number is. Colleagues will tell me we've got more than 60 advanced reactor designs out there in various stages of development. You don't necessarily need to have 60 in the marketplace to have a robust civil nuclear marketplace. So, from where I sit, I want to see them all do well, but I'm not going to be surprised if there is some consolidation along the way. At the end of the day, what matters is getting a robust suite of offerings, I would say, to serve that broad range of energy end uses I talked about earlier. So the grid, but going beyond the grid as well. I think that will best position us for success over the long term. With respect to kind of what's most likely to succeed here in the relatively near term, that's another thing that's going to be fascinating to me to see, because you've got the large reactors that there's a lot of experience with designing and constructing and operating. Although certainly here in the U.S. we haven't had that construction experience to any significant degree over the last several decades. Certainly the completion of the Vogtle 3 and 4 reactors in Georgia is a huge step in the right direction, but we really need to get to a sustained program of new build for any of these designs, and we're not there yet. The big question with the SMRs, and I include some of the advanced reactor designs in that definition of SMRs, is can this promise of factory fabrication and simplified construction in the field, can that lead to the types of cost and schedule improvements that will allow those technologies to successfully compete and win against the big plants? And that's something that it's quite a number of companies are going down that road because they're convinced that's the right way to go. And that's what we're going to need to see proven out here over the next decade or so, is the viability of that pathway. We do know that with the big plants, if you do get to a sustained program of new build and a stable regulatory environment, you look at the experience of places like South Korea and Japan, where they were, the Japanese were delivering new advanced boiling water reactors from first concrete pour to operation in less than 5 years, right? Well, so we know it can be done there. Every experience shows we should be able to do that with the small modular reactors as well. Got to demonstrate that here over the next decade, and then I think we'll have the broadest possible set of product offerings out there in the marketplace to serve needs not just here in the U.S. and North America, but around the world.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to seeing how things go here with those first deployments and who gets there to market, because I do think there's some real strong competitors out there right now that are focused off the shelf to hopefully drive that forward. A couple follow-ups here just based on a few things you said. I'll come back to what I'll call the 5 and 5 basis here in a moment and get back into what you started it on their relation to the Japanese and South Koreans. But just with the maritime applications, obviously, ocean freight applications, ocean transport would be a huge windfall to basically adopt naval technology into basically commercial ocean freighters for different purposes. Would make a lot of sense. But recently, I believe it was sometime actually last year, John, I don't remember the exact date here on this, but it's been out there for some time. The USS Nimitz was to be decommissioned, and there was an RFP process in the tunes of multi-billion dollars for the decommissioning of this unit. And just wanted to get your thoughts, with some of these things being decommissioned, why aren't they basically just retrofitted, parked at a dock and basically, or a mobile power plant to either be utilized in emergency purposes or even sold, de-weaponized to an island nation who can use a floating reactor? Doesn't that make more sense to use taxpayer money that way to retrofit rather than just decommission a perfectly good SMR?
I've got to say, with respect to that specific example, that's not something that's really in our wheelhouse here at NEI as an organization that focuses on the commercial nuclear reactor fleet. I will say that you are starting to see more and more recognition of the value of nuclear power and of the benefit of taking some of these facilities that were thought to be at end of life and bringing them back. And so I'll point to the deal in the state of Pennsylvania to restart the what used to be known as the 3 Mile Island site, now the Crane Clean Energy Center, bringing back that reactor, which was shut down a handful of years ago. There's also an effort in the state of Michigan right now to restart the Palisades nuclear power plant that was shut down. Again, both the Pennsylvania and Michigan examples really tied to insufficient revenues in electricity markets. And today we're seeing customers being willing to pay more for what nuclear delivers because they value that firm, clean, 24/7 attribute. So certainly from a efficiency of resource use standpoint, seeing those plants brought back, and then seeing companies committing to running today's reactors as long as possible. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen just about every reactor in the U.S., which was originally licensed for a 40-year period, now licensed out to 60 years, and we've got just about every company and every reactor in the country planning to operate out to 80 years. There's even some research going on now to figure out, okay, could you go beyond that 80-year period? So making most efficient use of our generating resources, I think is really smart. With nuclear, it's particularly valuable because once you build the reactors and you've paid off the construction loan, these are really affordable forms of very robust, clean and reliable power. The average nuclear plant in the U.S. costs about 3 cents a kilowatt hour to operate, and compare that with what your electricity bill looks like. It makes all the sense in the world to keep these generating resources running safely and efficiently as long as we can. So to your point about making maximum use of the resources we have, we're seeing more and more of that taking hold in nuclear.
John, and I want to work you on that for just a moment because it just ties right into what we were going to come back to. Obviously, the competitiveness can improve in the U.S., and that brings us back to issues of regulation, the red tape burden, as you well know, and those excessive costs, of course, lead time as well, to build those reactors in certain jurisdictions, and the U.S. is certainly included in that comment. We've seen Russia accumulate, as you well know, the majority share of not only fuel cycle services out there, but a strong position in turnkey reactor exports. And through that, we've also, I think, seen efficiencies over many decades on that front. And we've seen, of course, China deploy a notable domestic program, which backstop maybe their intentions in the future. But in these cases, because of those efforts that have been done, and maybe this wasn't a direct consequence of what the intentions were, but we've seen competitor reactors built on what I'd call a 5 and 5 basis, and that is less than 5-year build time, which you referred to earlier, and a price tag of less than about $5 billion US as well. In some cases, we've seen those achievements actually take place. And in the U.S., of course, that we don't come close to those numbers, at least in recent history here. And now going back to the period of the late 60s through the 90s, it was obviously a fantastic time to evaluate some of our efforts. I mean, the record-setting efforts back then were absolutely impressive, John. But can this be changed in your view? And what areas, maybe you can mention a few specifics here, what areas around policy do you think would actually facilitate the improvement on costs and lead times? We talked about permitting, but is there anywhere else there where we can slash regulation and get in line with what has actually been done previously?
So there's some things that can be done in the regulatory space, and frankly, there are things that the industry can do as well. We did see, to your questions about the operating costs of the existing plants, we did see quite a bit of cost reduction over the past decade. In fact, NEI led the formation of something called Delivering the Nuclear Promise, which was focused on increasing efficiencies and reducing operating costs at today's reactors. And we saw those go down by more than 30%. So a very considerable improvement on the part of the industry. And the same sort of effective lessons learned and operational experience sharing can and should take place as we look to bring new plants online. And so, for example, there's been quite a lot of investigation done into the experience at the Vogtle plant in Georgia. I will highlight that even there, just across the two reactors at that site, we did see significant improvement to the tune of something like 20% between Unit 3 and Unit 4 in terms of a cost and schedule improvement, because you learn by doing. And so, to your point about the Chinese and Russian experience, they've got more experience than we do. We used to do this very well, very cost effectively. And we've gotten out of practice. I have no hesitation in saying that I think we can do it again if we can get to that sustained program of new build. I would point you and your listeners again to that DOE Pathways to Commercial Liftoff report I referenced earlier. In there, they've got an analysis of what sorts of issues arose with the Vogtle construction and what sorts of measures should be taken to ensure more cost-effective construction going forward. We here at NEI actually do quite a bit on behalf of our members as well in terms of preparing construction best practices and other forms of lessons learned materials that we provide to our members to help them as they think about planning for new build. But for the purposes of your readers, I think that the DOE treatment of this would be a great place to start in understanding what sorts of opportunities exist to get us down that cost and schedule curve.
And of course, the NEI is one of those leaders in pushing this forward. So I appreciate your guys' efforts because it is quite a challenge and it's difficult to deal with Washington, as you well know, amongst some of the departments. It's quite difficult in this day and time.
And one thing I should have added there, pardon the interruption, but I should have called out the ADVANCE Act in the bipartisan effort in Congress to get the Nuclear Regulatory Commission more focused on modernizing their approach to regulation as the technology modernizes. And so the early indications we've seen out of the NRC have been good in terms of improved cost and schedule performance, but that's going to be an area that's going to require ongoing vigilance to ensure that we continue to see the regulator improving while maintaining safety and operations at the same time that the industry continues to get better and better.
Absolutely. Fully agreed there, and glad to see that is hopefully starting to facilitate some changes there and improvement among efficiencies within some of these agencies. It certainly needs to happen. John, just another topic here before we move on and start to wrap up here. I appreciate the time once again. Just on the issue of waste, I think this is a fairly quick discussion here on the issue of waste in the industry. First of all, I think waste is generally a non-issue comparatively to other sources of energy that we draw from, and that the waste footprint of battery cycles and in wind and solar cycles is a tremendous issue, substantial orders of magnitude larger than the issue of discussion about what do we do with secured waste casks that are stored mostly at operating facilities around the United States. And really, if you aggregated those where they would fit, they're inert nature and not causing any trouble other than consuming a little bit of space. Let's not even talk about proliferation of nuclear waste. It's just almost laughable to think the logistics involved of stealing waste to make a weapon is just crazy to even start to go down that rabbit hole. But just your comments. Do you see that waste is an issue comparatively, and any comments on the issue of commercial reactor waste?
Yeah, so great question, and I should acknowledge that in a past life I was staff director for something called the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, which recommended a new strategy for spent fuel management in the U.S. And then when I went back into DOE in 2015, was charged with standing up a consent-based program for finding sites for new nuclear waste management facilities. So I spent a lot of time on this issue, and actually worked when I worked at the Idaho National Laboratory, worked at a site that was host to several spent fuel storage facilities. So very familiar with the technology itself. The good news is that storing spent nuclear fuel and keeping it isolated from people, the public, and the environment is technically very straightforward to do. And the things like the long-term dry storage casks that we have at today's nuclear reactors, which are very simple steel and concrete structures. They're a very straightforward way of managing this fuel safely over the long term, which we've been doing at plant sites for more than 60 years. But it's true that over the long term, we do need to find a path forward and a final resting place for our spent nuclear fuel. To your earlier point, there isn't a whole lot of it in terms of volume, but thus far we've been stymied in efforts, less from a technical perspective than from a socio-political perspective. But here we are. Other countries have found ways to move forward, and in fact, Finland has completed initial construction of their spent fuel repository, is in the testing phase now, and expects to start emplacing spent fuel as early as next year. Our friends in Canada just selected their preferred repository site from a list of what was initially 22 communities that volunteered to be considered to host a spent fuel repository. And when I say a repository, what I mean is a deep underground mined facility where you use a combination of the physical attributes of that mined location combined with packaging materials that you put the spent fuel in to ensure safety of people in the environment from that material over tens of thousands of years. The folks in Sweden have got a site identified, again, with the support of the local community, as is enjoyed in Canada and Finland. France is moving forward with their repository program. So we've seen that this can be done. We just need to get, in particular, Congress, but also the administration to come to agreement on what the path forward is going to look like here in the U.S. So we are going to need to see Congress legislate on this issue, because under current law, the federal government has accepted the responsibility for spent nuclear fuel management and disposal after it leaves the nuclear power plant site. They did that in the early 80s in exchange for a payment from nuclear generated electricity to help pay the costs of providing for storage and disposal. At this point, more than $45 billion sits in something called the Nuclear Waste Fund, which has been collected from consumers of nuclear generated electricity, and that money is intended to be used to develop a repository and other elements of an integrated nuclear waste management system. So the money exists to address the challenge. We just need to get the policy straight and get Congress to authorize the administration to begin moving forward with a new program leading ultimately to a disposal facility. But again, going back to where I started, in the short term, this stuff is safely and straightforwardly managed at plant sites. I've worked around it and have no hesitation about being around these storage facilities. But over the longer term, we got to get a new program in place. That also raises the question of, will recycling of nuclear fuel, as is practiced in some other countries, will that reemerge in the conversation here in the U.S.? Seems to be more interest in that coming out of Congress and coming out of some of the companies, particularly among companies that use what we call high assay nuclear fuel. So instead of that 3 to 5% enriched fuel I mentioned earlier, something more in the 10 to 20% range. Since there's more value reflected in that higher enrichment fuel, there may be more of an economic incentive to retrieve it and reuse it. And so that could lead to more of a conversation around recycling in the U.S., and that could play a role in complementing other parts of an integrated nuclear waste management system.
Very good points, and I appreciate you sharing your thoughts and views. And obviously, you've spent some good time on this matter, and it's an interesting one from our desk as well, just looking at it and how things can certainly be mitigated in a very simple fashion. And then, of course, the safety and security of waste is very straightforward, in my opinion, and the logistics required to breach that is substantial. But just had to ask you this, John, and of course, this is a question you might just laugh at and may not decide to answer, but any recommendations for the battery waste and solar panel waste and wind turbine waste that we're to be faced with in the coming decades?
There have been quite a number of conversations around effective storage and maybe recycling of some of those materials. As I'm sure you've seen the same pictures I have with the wind turbine blades being disposed in near surface disposal facilities. There's obviously going to be quite a bit in the way of solar panel waste that we'll have to deal with as those panels reach the end of their we'll call it 15, 20-year operating life, depending on the technology. So there's, I would just say, I do think it's important for the companies themselves, but also the users of those panels in the states that have been promoting their use to ensure there's an appropriate focus on safe long-term disposal of that material, because as you know, there's some nasties in there as well that you want to keep isolated from people in the environment. And so while I'm less attuned to the day-to-day of what's going on in that space, I do know that it's a recognized issue, and just want to ensure that it is managed appropriately over the long term. The one advantage we have with nuclear, as you know, is when it comes to spent nuclear fuel, we know where it all is. Right? I mean, it's either in the spent fuel pool or it's in a dry storage cask at the plant site. Right? And so it's very straightforward to account for. And when we do get an integrated waste management system up and running here in the U.S., we'll have high confidence that everything that has been generated is safely disposed.
Absolutely. And it goes right back to quality of energy. It goes right back to those key features of nuclear energy that nothing else can really challenge. And I think that that's an important piece to point out there as well. And with the wind and solar part of it, just the liabilities, the reclamation liabilities on the surface of the land that they're being utilized on is also another major issue that nobody really has started to calculate, quantify, or decide how this is going to be handled. But I do think that people are starting to wake up and realize that there are other better options out there. So appreciate the comments on that, John. Well, just to wrap up here, John, I appreciate the additional time here. Are there any policy matters or challenges you're seeing in the industry that are being missed out there, or maybe we didn't discuss today?
I'd go back to where I started in terms of ensuring that we've got the policies in place to continue ensuring operational excellence in our nuclear fleet here in the U.S. I mean, things like effective implementation of the Advance Act, focusing on the regulatory front, but also the implementation of the programs designed to bring more nuclear fuel conversion and enrichment capabilities to the U.S. Those things, successfully implementing what we've got is going to be really important. Keeping the successes we've achieved, whether it's federal policies to support continued operation of existing plants or build new plants, is going to be really important. To get to new construction, I do think that getting some sort of a program in place that's going to help address some of the unique cost and schedule challenges that come from building the first few of these capital intensive new projects is going to be an important part of getting new nuclear off the drawing board and into very widespread construction here in the U.S. And that's going to lead into that last piece about ensuring that we're competing and winning in export markets and successfully competing against the Russians and the Chinese who currently dominate global nuclear power plant construction. One last thing I would mention is that a bit of a plug for something called Nuclear Matters, but in addition to my role at NEI, I also serve as president of Nuclear Matters, which is our grassroots advocacy coalition. Signing up for Nuclear Matters is a great way to stay plugged in on what's going on in the nuclear energy policy and public affairs space. And so to the extent folks are interested in staying engaged, sign up for Nuclear Matters. It doesn't cost you anything, and we offer some pretty good content. So thanks for the opportunity to make a plug.
John, absolutely. And I'm going to give you one other opportunity here as well. First, our audience should absolutely do their part, get involved, and signing up for some of these things. It keeps you informed, it educates, and you're able to go tell other people as the energy conversation comes up at the table, which probably does come up more often these days because it's obviously a daily part of our lives, and also we pay for it, that this is very useful sources of information. And of course, getting the word out about what the NEI is doing, also very important. John, it was great to talk to you, but before we go, I want to have you cover just a couple things. First, why should folks who are listening in who might represent research organizations who are already involved in the industry, but maybe are not an NEI member or have an associated business tied to the industry, why should they consider becoming an NEI member, first of all, and also why should they consider attending an NEI conference event in the near future?
Yeah, so really appreciate that. To the extent that companies are interested in learning more and really becoming a part of the nuclear energy ecosystem here in the U.S. Becoming an NEI member makes a lot of sense. I mentioned earlier that we have quite a number of utility members, but in fact, we've got a very broad-based membership. So universities that have nuclear engineering or nuclear-related capabilities, law firms, construction firms, fuel supply, conversion enrichment, mining companies are members of NEI. Certainly the big companies that are involved in the engineering, procurement, construction business, in addition to those innovators who are out there trying to bring new nuclear to the marketplace. So you name it across the nuclear energy life cycle and ecosystem, chances are if there's somebody prominent in nuclear, they're an NEI member. And even if it doesn't make sense for you to join NEI, we do offer quite a bit in the way of programming. I'm responsible for something called the Nuclear Energy Policy Forum, which we'll host again in the spring, but we've also got our nuclear energy conference and expo that will come up next September, and quite a number of other events, including a nuclear financing summit that's being planned for January. I encourage you to check out our website at nei.org to see what sort of programming that's available to the public that you might consider participating in. And if that does tickle your interest in becoming a member, there's also quite a bit that we do in terms of conferences, working groups, task forces, trainings, what have you, for our membership that, while it isn't public, if you were to decide to join NEI, you could have access to that sort of thing too.
John, excellent. And just one more time here, besides the website, which folks now know about, how can interested parties learn more about the NEI and potentially become a member? Is there a specific contact person they should talk to, or should they just go to the website?
They can certainly go to the site, or to the extent folks are interested, they can reach out to me. I'm just jfk@nei.org, and I'm happy to play quarterback and hand off to the right folks within the organization if folks want to do it that way.
John, very kind of you for that. Well, look, thanks for taking the time. It was an extensive conversation. We hope you'll come back in the future to update on NEI work as well as to talk industry matters. Thank you.
That'd be my pleasure. Hey, thanks so much for having me.